with word from the White House, the meeting between President Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu wrapping up here. We're going to keep an eye out for a statement from the White House, a readout, as we call it, from the press office to hear what was said in that meeting. Of course, an eye on potential funding, if not just the providing of weapons for Israel, has become much more controversial with this more recent story of the killing of 7 aid workers at the World Central Kitchen. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for coming along. A Balance of Power, the Thursday edition, live from Washington. As we turn our attention to what is about to happen, or I guess not happen, on Capitol Hill, lawmakers, boy, this has been a long recess, right? They're still at home, the home district work period. Others call it recess. Look, some of them are working, some are on Codell's, some of them are probably watching TV right now, or maybe YouTube. But when they come back, there's going to be a lot to do here. And apparently one of the very first orders of business will be funding for Ukraine. Speaker Mike Johnson promising that the return from Easter will bring this matter to the floor at once. And that is, of course, why Marjorie Taylor Greene filed the motion to vacate. So he'll have this hanging over his head as he tries to get work done. The fact of the matter is they have not moved the rock on anything since the last time we sat down with Mike Dorning. And that's been at least a week. He's with us now at the table. Mike Dorning, of course, Bloomberg politics editor. It's great to see you. We're talking about a loan now, potentially, for Ukraine. We're also talking about a world in which it would take a majority of Democrats to pass anything. Is that the end of Mike Johnson's
well,
speaker?
It could be. It's unclear, and the White House seems to be giving them a little space. They're not like criticizing Johnson a bunch, even though they asked for this money back in October, and it's been half a year for the emergency funding. Still not there.
Right.
But, you know, this is a tough for him because he's got a very small majority. The hardliners don't really want to give money to Ukraine. And, you know, he's got a lot of Republicans and Democrats who do want to help support Ukraine. So he's got to thread the needle here. He's brought up some of these ideas. I don't think they've really coalesced into an actual proposal, but he's doing the Washington thing of sending up floating ideas and sounding them out. The loan is one idea that President Trump, the leader of the Republican Party, had offered, and that, you know, it's kind of ludicrous in a way because you don't really expect they'd ever pay back this loan. I mean, the country's being invaded, its economy's destroyed, but at least it allows you to say that it's a loan, and, you know, maybe possibly someday their economy might be strong again, and at some point you might get some money back.
Yes, right. In the meantime, there's got to be an agreement so they can craft some legislation. That's going to take a minute. We're reporting that it could be weeks before anything sees the light of day.
You know, our reporters have spoken to, you know, key sources in the Republican leadership, and pretty much the message they've gotten across the board is nothing's going to happen for weeks here. At a minimum, it could take longer. Now, Speaker Johnson had said in his interview that they would do it right away when they came back, but I think the response is right away is kind of in the eye of the beholder. You know, a Washington right away might not be the same thing as a Bloomberg newsroom right away.
Fair enough. You mentioned, I think this is fascinating, the White House giving Mike Johnson space. Reports have said they're actually in touch, that he's, you know, talking to the White House directly about what might come next year, which is the very thing that's going to turn the Freedom Caucus and conservative Republicans away from him.
I think
fair?
It's possible, although just talking to the White House, that's
not a sin?
That's kind of something that you always have to do when you're in Congress.
You would think.
But I think the thing that will turn them away from him is the idea that you're relying so much on Democrats to get stuff done. Now, like a long time ago in Washington, that was the way it happened all the time. You kind of let the majority of Congress work its will within some parameters set by the speaker, but nowadays they want to go to a much more partisan control of the House. And in this case, the hardliners in particular are saying, hey, if a lot of Republicans don't want something, you shouldn't do it. It's very clear, though, that Speaker Johnson, even though he had voted against Ukraine aid in the past, has said that he does want Ukraine aid, that he does want to help Ukraine, and that's his view of what's right. He just argues that other things have to happen first, and they're a higher priority.
Spending time with Mike Dorning on Balance of Power, I want to ask you about Israel. We just had a headline cross the terminal that says everything about Joe Biden's political situation when it comes to Israel, domestically speaking. Warren, Durbin, Elizabeth Warren, Dick Durbin urge Biden to boost medical supplies and aid to Gaza. This is reaching a point of controversy and urgency that he's not faced yet. We understand he just had the meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu. What does he do with progressive Democrats screaming from the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue?
Well, I mean, actually, I would say that Warren and Durbin are like not bad people to look to because they're both quite progressive, but they also both have very strong relations with very strong Jewish communities in their states who are Democratic-leaning Jewish communities. And you see what they're doing is, unlike a lot of the progressives that aren't as strongly aligned with the Jewish community as Warren and Durbin, they're not saying stop sending weapons or anything. They're just saying send more aid. And that's kind of a way you can address some progressive concerns and still show that you're allied with Israel. But definitely Biden has to thread a needle here. He's personally very much aligned with Israel and is a big personal supporter of Israel. And there's a large segment of the Democratic Party that is very supportive of Israel. But there's also a large segment of the Democratic Party that's saying, hey, this is ridiculous, more than 30,000 casualties. Now you've got these aid workers bombed, and this organization is run by a very prominent Washington chef who's very active socially and
knows all of these
knows all the key Democratic politicians in Washington. So there's a personal tie here.
I think it's a really important part of the story that might not be initially assumed when you hear about a chef. Something like this happens. This is someone who's really part of the fabric, even the political fabric in Washington. Remember when he pulled his restaurant out of the Trump hotel and the impact that had locally and nationally in that story.
And he's specifically been close with the Obama White House and also to some extent the Biden White House.
Yes. So with all of that said, you're hearing from Chris Coons, Chris Van Hollen, real allies of Joe Biden, that we need to reconsider the sending of weapons to Israel. They're referring to 2,000-pound bombs that we're just sending this week after the strike against the World Central Kitchen, whether it was accidental or not. Are we talking about strings attached? How does that come out in the form of legislation, if at all?
Well, I'm not sure how it would come out.
There's a drive for some conditions, though, right?
You could impose conditions that they have to, that we do have laws that say you cannot just give weapons to someone that's going to use them in a way that violates international humanitarian law. And I don't know exactly how that works within the administration and how, lawyers can always interpret things some ways, but there has been pushback that, hey, what Israel's doing doesn't really comply with international humanitarian law, which says you should try to avoid civilian casualties to the extent you can. And in fact, in Britain, there's a whole big push to get them to stop sending weapons on these very grounds that has a broad sort of popular thing with protests around the country. Here also you have Democrats getting increasingly concerned about it, and it is something that just strikes at the heart of the Democratic Party, that it divides the party. And with Joe Biden, in his reelection, what he really needs to do is get his people more enthused to turn out to vote. The Trump supporters are enthused. They're going to turn out. And with Biden, he needs to rev up people. And when he's fracturing his party, he's going to turn off one side or the other. Even if they don't go over to Trump, they'll just be less enthused, less likely to vote. And that is a key strategic problem he faces down the line. It's the biggest strategic problem he faces in his campaign. And this is just one way in which that is surfacing.
Fascinating. Great to see you. I was looking forward to it. Mike Dorning, of course, a voice that we rely on heavily here on Balance of Power and helps to edit our political coverage here in Washington. Great to see you, Mike, and thanks for spending some time with us.
Great to be here.
Yes, sir. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We'll assemble our panel next after we get up to date on world and national news with Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Joe. President Biden is speaking by phone today to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The president has said Israel has not done enough to protect civilians after the deaths of 7 World Central Kitchen workers this week in Gaza. Bloomberg government's Jack Fitzpatrick says he is watching whether the president's shift in tone will be met with action.
The Biden administration has not shown a plan or sort of previewed more specific changes in the policy toward support for Israel. And that's the question that's being debated.
Bloomberg government's Jack Fitzpatrick covers Congress from Washington. Israel is bracing for a retaliatory Iranian attack following its raid on the Iranian embassy in Iraq. Israel's economic minister, Nir Barkat, tells Bloomberg that Israelis remain traumatized by the Hamas invasion.
There's consensus in Israel. The war will not be over until we eradicate all of Hamas. Sitting in Rafah, 1/4 of Hamas, we will fight evil until they surrender. There's no other choice. And time is not on our side.
Barkat says it's not only Iran that is funding jihadists. He says Qatar is backing them too, claiming that country is untrustworthy as a Middle East mediator. And Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is again in China discussing the parameters of economic relations as China seeks to export its way out of its slowdown. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
Get the news you need to start your day in just 15 minutes.
Now to the latest on the war in the Middle East.
Optimism that the Fed will be able to engineer a soft landing.
Wake up with Bloomberg Daybreak, U.S. edition.
The Supreme Court is set to hear oral arguments tomorrow.
A lot of upsets in college basketball.
Available now on your podcast feed. Each weekday morning at 6 a.m. Eastern.
The latest in the presidential race.
Subscribe to Bloomberg Daybreak, U.S. edition today on Apple, Spotify, and everywhere you get your podcasts. Bloomberg Radio. Context changes everything.
This is a Bloomberg Real Estate Report. I'm Denise Pellegrini. If new homes seem smaller lately, you're probably right, because builders are building smaller homes. Rose Quint, Assistant Vice President for Survey Research at the National Association of Home Builders.
The average size of new homes dropped to about 2,411 square feet in 2023, and that was the smallest average home size in 13 years, since 2010.
And Quint says builders have been building smaller and smaller homes for years now.
Basically, when the average size of new homes peaked at 2,689, it's been falling for the better part of a decade now.
Consumers wanting smaller homes, plus rising land, materials, and labor costs are all behind the shrinking home size, along with rising mortgage rates. And that's all been conspiring to make larger homes unaffordable for a growing number of Americans. Quint says homes are going to get even smaller this year.
About a quarter of builders in a recent survey say that they will build smaller homes, smaller even than what they built in 2023.
And that's the Bloomberg Real Estate Report. I'm Denise Pellegrini.
Some days I cover up because of my moderate to severe plaque psoriasis. Now I'm hitting the road with clearer skin thanks to Skyrizi, Risankizumab Riza, a prescription-only 150 milligram injection for adults who are candidates for systemic or phototherapy. With Skyrizi, 3 out of 4 people achieved 90% clearer skin at 4 months. And Skyrizi is just 4 doses a year after 2 starter doses.
Don't use if allergic to Skyrizi. Serious allergic reactions and an increased risk of infections or a lower ability to fight them may occur. Before treatment, your doctor should check for infection and tuberculosis. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms such as fever, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, or if you plan to or recently received a vaccine.
Thanks to Skyrizi, there's nothing on my skin, and that means everything. Ask your doctor today about Skyrizi, the #1 dermatologist prescribed biologic in psoriasis, and visit skyrizi.com or call 1-866-SKY-RIZZI to learn more.
Why just listen to Bloomberg Surveillance when you can also watch us live on YouTube? I'm Lisa Mateo.
And I'm Tom Keene. Join us weekday mornings along with Paul Sweeney and Michael Barr starting at 7 a.m.
Head to the Bloomberg podcast page on YouTube to hear and see the smartest voices on global markets and investment.
Make Bloomberg Surveillance an essential part of your morning routine weekdays from 7 to 10.
Visit the Bloomberg podcast page on YouTube and click on the live feed to join us today.
Bloomberg Radio, on demand and in your podcast feed.
On the latest edition of the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast, a conversation with Michael Stubblefield, President and CEO of Avantor, on opportunities in the life sciences industry and the challenges ahead.
One of the things that I really like about our business is just the exposure we have to some really attractive end markets. You've referenced biopharma and biotech and healthcare space. And when I look at the health of those end markets, I think we're quite excited about the long-term positioning of the space, really driven by record levels of new drug approvals, pipelines that are as robust as they've ever been, and new therapeutic platforms, whether that be cell and gene therapy, GLP-1s that have been getting a lot of attention. And so I would say the fundamentals for our space are really robust. And as some of these headwinds that have been plaguing the industry that we just talked about, whether it be supply chain or just some of the normalization coming out of COVID, as those things subside, I think we're really well positioned to for a strong setup and to be able to leverage the momentum that's in our end markets.
I guess just what's one of the bigger headwinds that you are facing here that you need to get your hands around? Stock's done well, but what's a key challenge for you guys these days? Yes,
when we looked at some of the things that have impacted our growth in our industry over the last year or so, it's things like inventory destocking as our customers are normalizing their inventories. Some of the supply chain constraints, whether it be access to raw materials or even just our own production capacity that we've been able to, debottleneck with investments. Those things have largely normalized.
Hear the full conversation on the latest edition of the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Subscribe on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Plus, listen anytime on the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pellet. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, all pushing higher ahead of tomorrow morning's jobs report. Right now, we're trading very close to the best level of the day on the S&P 500 index, up 42 now, up 0.8%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 187, up by about 0.5%. NASDAQ is up 188, a gain there of 1.2%. 10-year 4.34%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.69%. Spot gold down $11 the ounce to $22.88, drop there of 0.5%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil now lower by 0.6%, $84.95 a barrel. There is a fresh tally of jobless claims ahead of tomorrow morning's jobs report. They are creeping higher, as we hear from Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Weekly jobless claims are up the highest since January, 221,000. While the labor market is holding its ground, planned job cuts are on the rise, the highest in the year based on industry data. Amazon is among the latest, announcing hundreds of cloud division cuts. For now, Friday's payroll report is forecast to show a respectable gain. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Vinny mentioned Amazon up now by 1.4%. Boeing's latest 737 MAX crisis has worsened an airline shortage of popular narrow-body aircraft, sending the cost of used jet rentals to the highest in years. The plane maker has been slowing production of its best-selling model to address quality lapses tied to a near disaster on a 737 MAX 9 jet in January. Boeing shares are up now by about 1.6%. Again, recapping stocks higher. S&P up 42 right now, up 0.8%. I'm Charlie Pellet. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. And once again, your host, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you. Welcome to the Thursday edition of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We call it Little Friday around here. I think I saw Baby Friday in one of the tip sheets today. That means we're close to the threshold of the weekend. And I'll tell you what, it's going to be a party in Palm Beach, not to be outdone by Joe Biden. Donald Trump cooks up plans for a massive fundraiser that will raise more money than Joe Biden managed to bring in alongside Barack Obama and Bill Clinton in New York City last week. Remember the big Radio City Music Hall? Lizzo, Queen Latifah, $26 million. Joe Biden. Donald Trump is on track to raise $43 million in one night at this fundraiser. The inaugural leadership dinner, led by hedge fund billionaire John Paulson, reportedly tops out at a chairman level. $824,000 will put you at Donald Trump's table for dinner that night. How much would it cost to get on his iPad, though? You see this Axios earlier this morning? Speaking of the tip sheets, with the story about DJT, not letters DJT, I mean DJ, DEEJAY. Donald Trump, he likes to play his own music at Mar-a-Lago. And as we learned today, it's quite the lineup of greatest hits here. Elvis, Phantom of the Opera, Guns N' Roses, Sinead O'Connor. Nothing makes sense. Let's assemble our panel. Jeannie Shanzano is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor. Glad to say she's back today alongside Chapin Fay, Actum Managing Director and Republican Strategist. It's great to have you both with us. Jeannie, what do you think on the greatest hits here? It's being compared to the way Donald Trump runs his campaign speeches. Just keep playing the hits. It's a method that has worked for him.
Did you just say Sinead O'Connor is on that list?
Yes.
I'm stunned.
He's a big fan of Nothing Compares to You, Jeannie.
Yeah, I have to agree with him there. A great song. I'm just surprised by that one. So the list doesn't make much sense. I would say, just having talked to a bunch of people between the age of 18 and about 22, 23, very few of the people you listed are on the top of their mind. So if he wants the young vote, he may need to dig a little deeper in that list.
I'm with you. Lionel Richie, anybody? Jesus Christ Superstar.
No, Joe, that's not it.
I didn't think so. Chapin, you pull in $43 million. That's a big haul. If he can do it, it would be record-setting, just like Joe Biden was last week. From a campaign management standpoint, is that smart? Maybe it is. I'm just curious. Do you tap all the billionaires, the whales, in April when you might need them in October?
Yeah, it's a challenge. He has sort of lost much of his small donor money, so he's got to depend on these billionaires. You can just feel how much this event at Radio City Music Hall bothered him, and the idea that it was described as the most lucrative fundraising in American history, or fundraiser in American history. He wants to beat that. We don't know if he will. One thing we can probably all agree is he will inflate those numbers until we get some real numbers out of from the campaign folks. But, he's trying to top Joe Biden. I think the question now is, for two people who are as well known as Joe Biden and Donald Trump, at what point does this money, this big money, stop, really helping them? Political scientists say, there's a point at which this isn't going to give them any more votes. So you need the money, but how much is another question.
Yeah. Chapin, sorry, give me your take on this. Is this good politics? Is it smart business to max out your donors in April?
Well, if you can max out a donor, I say do it as soon as you can, right? You need the money. And, on the campaign side of things, I always say, you have to be first. You want to be first in politics, right? If you're the second candidate to announce his candidacy, you're the second guy, right? The first guy or girl or woman has, taken all the press. I would like to just take a step back to your question about, at what point does the money stop mattering? I mean, to a certain extent, it already does. Just to put up some, guide rails on this conversation for context, he was outspent by Joe Biden by $300 million in 2020, and in 2016 he spent half of what Hillary Clinton spent and won. So I think what you're seeing now is sort of the media war. Every FEC filing, period on every campaign is a race to raise as much money as you can, pull in as much money as you can to show, to legitimize your candidacy, right? That's not necessarily the right way to say it about someone like President Trump or Joe Biden, who are already legitimate candidates. We could argue about that later. But, new candidates, they have to establish themselves. And one of the ways you do that, one of the metrics, right? And especially with the media, you and everyone else in the media talks about the fundraising wars, right? So it is important to be record setting. It is important to win. I mean, there'll be people who are surprised that Donald Trump is bringing in this much money, or even Joe Biden, and maybe it makes them think, what am I, I haven't contributed. What am I missing here? So it is important for the metrics purposes. And again, you want to be able to even the playing field as much as you can. So it is important in the end. But Donald Trump has already proven he can be successful being outspent 2-1.
Yeah, it is interesting. Jeannie, we have to acknowledge, and you've talked about this, if Donald Trump is the king of earned media, what does it matter anyway?
That's right. And Chapin is absolutely right. I mean, he pointed to 2020 and 2016, 2-1. Hillary Clinton outspent Donald Trump. And as we all know, he still won. And this is in keeping with the data, which shows that once you reach a threshold of name recognition, you do get the benefit of touting to the media that you've broken these records, and that can be helpful. But most of our research shows that you can reduce campaign spending by 50%, and you're not going to get more votes. So there is a point at which this doesn't help. That's in the data, but we know that Donald Trump wants to say, I've got this record. You know, he doesn't want Joe Biden to best him on anything, particularly raising money. So I think a lot of this with Donald Trump is going to be ego. He's sort of been goaded into this by the Biden campaign. And I think, you know, we're going to see a lot of this as this campaign goes forward.
I'd love to ask you both about what's happening at the White House today. We're talking about Donald Trump's campaign. Let's get into Joe Biden for a moment and the Achilles heel that emerged yet again on primary night this week with an uncommitted protest vote that showed up in states like Connecticut and Rhode Island. We talked about this yesterday. A little more important when it shows up in a state like Wisconsin, which we saw this week. We understand he's on the horn right now with Benjamin Netanyahu. Their meeting is underway with a very difficult conversation. Chapin, what does Joe Biden do coming out of this meeting that's obviously not public to try to move the needle domestically in a way that will make progressives happy?
Well, I don't know if that's possible. And, you know, I'm sure progressives think the same thing about me, but I don't know if they're ever going to be able to be made happy, particularly in this, you know, in this situation, which is complicated for the president and, you know, people on the other side of the issue. This is very complicated, and it doesn't break down strictly by party lines. So President Biden does have to figure out how to communicate a support for one of our, you know, staunchest allies in a war to defend themselves, while also not losing the progressive wing of his base. And it's incredibly important and difficult for him now because we're in an election year, and we have seen some protest votes against him. But he has to be careful. He could lose a lot more votes when it comes to the general election. Now, you know, the flip side of that is Donald Trump seems to be able to bring out you know, progressives and Democrats and everyone on the left out of the woodwork to come vote. So maybe that won't be an issue, but it very well may be. And I think you see, you know, Donald Trump is winning in 6 of 7 contested or targeted states or contested states right now. You know, President Biden does need to be very cautious about losing people. He needs to be building coalitions. And it's difficult. You know, I have some very strong views on this. Israel is our staunchest ally. And I think he probably will never have me as a voter of this election cycle, but, you know, he would lose, people who care about foreign policy. He's going to lose them if he sees to, you know, be slipping in his support. But his campaign has to figure out what the, you know, sort of the give and take, the cost benefit analysis here on how he does communicate what this meeting is. By the way, that meeting itself may be very tense and a strange conversation. Yes, right. Because they are, Netanyahu seems to be losing some of his own support as well. So, and he's in the middle of a war, right? So the two of them have to figure out, as, you know, two staunch allies, how to navigate this moving forward together. I think if they distance themselves too much from each other, it'll be bad for both men.
Well, we're going to have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about this in our next hour, with Chapin Fay and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino once that call resolves. And we've got our eyes out, of course, on a readout from the White House. More with our panel coming up in hour 2. So be with us as we bring our TV audience into the conversation here from Washington as well. I'm Joe Matthew. Kaylee Lyons will join at that point with an eye on the economy here. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about jobs. I guess we already are. That's the way this goes with a string of data. Tomorrow's the big one, of course. And we wanted to connect with Molly Smith in New York with JOLTS in the air here. Job openings a little changed in February. I want to get a sense of what we're in for tomorrow, this day after we heard from Jay Powell. Molly edits our economic data coverage on the terminal and online. And Molly, I wonder if we've got good news for Joe Biden tomorrow or not. And of course, this is a good news, bad news situation when you factor in the Fed. He doesn't always look for the same stuff the market does he?
No, he definitely doesn't. So I think right now, it's kind of hard to find things in the job market that aren't going well for Joe Biden. Of course, the difficulty in that is how he communicates that to the voter base. And obviously the overriding challenge being inflation. seems to be wiping out a lot of that optimism. But keeping it with the jobs report for now, we're expecting to see a fourth straight month of payroll gains of over 200,000. That's well over the average rate, going into the pandemic. This is still a very high rate of job growth that we're seeing, and really just fits into this narrative of a very only gradually cooling labor market, that the unemployment rate, yeah, it's a bit high for where it's been in this cycle, but historically still pretty low at under 4%. And wage gains are looking like they'll probably continue to moderate on a year-over-year basis. So these are things that the Fed wants to see, too, in a way that if you can get this great blend of robust hiring but wage gains slowing, that really fits this whole soft landing narrative really well. So it could actually be one of these rare situations where this is good news for both Biden and the Fed if they can manage to spin it that way.
Only Molly Smith could bring the good news on both sides here.
We try.
That's a lot of pressure. That's too much pressure. But I was struck by Jay Powell's remarks on the job market yesterday. Molly, he was speaking at Stanford. We carried the remarks live. And, of course, he's got a dual mandate. We talk about, interest rates all day long around here, but his view on the job market, tight labor market over time does enormous social good. What does he think about the data tomorrow on the status of this job market?
Right. So it is refreshing, I guess, in a way that the Fed chair, he does think about us everyday people. It's not just talking to a room full of economists all the time, and to be a bit more real. Like, of course, to think, it's not like saying something so, controversial that like a strong job market has benefits to a lot of people for a long period of time. I think what was really interesting, what he was saying, and that a lot of economists have been zoning in on, were his comments on how much more benefit we can get from the supply side in terms of more workers still coming back to the labor force, in terms of other improvements in supply chains, and how all of these different resources can still be tapped to still help ease inflation. So that really seems like he still thinks there's more room on that side of the equation to help get inflationary pressures down.
I just think about those conversations that he had with Elizabeth Warren a year or two ago.
I don't think he likes to think about those conversations.
Dangerous man. No, I bet he doesn't. Maybe in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. But she was accusing him of preparing to destroy the job market. And Molly, that hasn't happened.
I remember, I think we all probably do, her pointing the finger at Jay Powell and calling him a, quote, dangerous man. So that quote will forever ring on, but it hasn't really happened yet. And of course, that's not to be insensitive to the fact that the unemployment rate has risen from, 3.5, I think, at the trough of this, to 3.9 now. So people have lost their jobs, but we're not talking the massive job losses that typically accompany a downturn.
I'm glad you could join us, Molly. We'll be thinking about you at 8:30 tomorrow morning when the jobs report is released. Molly Smith with us live from New York. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Glad you're with us on the fastest show in politics. Kaylee Lyons will join the conversation in less than 5 minutes, only here on Bloomberg. Make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. If you haven't already, get to Apple or Spotify, wherever you do that stuff, and subscribe. Watch us live on YouTube and listen anytime at Bloomberg.com.
Now, your 3-day weather forecast on Bloomberg 1130.
It'll stay mainly cloudy for the rest of today, along with some gusty winds at times and a few scattered showers. Temperatures upper 40s, low 50s. Tonight evening showers end, 35 to 40 overnight. Maybe a passing shower Friday afternoon, otherwise clouds and sun near 50. In the 50s here for the weekend, maybe close to 60 on Sunday. Both days will feature a mix of clouds and sun. This is Gary Best with your weekend weather forecast on Bloomberg 1130.
The best of Bloomberg Business Week every business day.
Everybody loves this story. We're all talking about it.
Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stanavek.
Feels like this week is really a roller coaster.
The day's breaking global business, finance, and tech news, along with smart analysis.
This stock has been on a tear.
The Bloomberg Business Week podcast.
New AI products in the pipeline.
Listen live weekday afternoons at 2 or on demand wherever you get your podcasts. Bloomberg Radio. Context changes everything.
Have you Googled yourself lately? Are there negative posts from an ex-employee or from a former client? Maybe an outdated news article or sensitive personal information about your family? Search engines don't always get it right. For right or wrong, it's your reputation on the line. That's where Reputation Defender by Norton comes in. One of the most trusted names in online reputation repair, Reputation Defender has been fixing people's search results for over 15 years. Their cutting-edge approaches help you to wipe away unwanted information in your search results. They also promote the good stuff, so that it rises to the top, helping you put your best foot forward. Your good name is too valuable to leave to the whims of a Google algorithm. Take control with Reputation Defender. You can start by getting your free reputation report card at reputationdefender.com or call 800-948-6033 to speak to an expert. That's 800-948-6033.
Buzz around artificial intelligence is seemingly everywhere. Is your portfolio keeping up? Consider the Global X Artificial Intelligence and Technology ETF, ticker AIQ, which invests in dozens of stocks at the leading edge of this disruption. Investing involves risk, including possible loss of principal. Technology companies can be affected by rapid product obsolescence and intense industry competition. Before investing, carefully consider the fund's objectives, risks, charges, expenses, and more in the full or summary prospectus at globalxetfs.com. Read carefully. Distributed by SEI Investments Distribution Co.
Bloomberg Radio, where the experts come to listen.
I'm listening every morning when I'm driving into Washington, D.C. You're terrific.
One of the reasons I love Bloomberg is I'm allowed to geek out. Yesterday I was driving around. I put on your show. I learned 5 things in about 3 minutes. Bloomberg's really one of the places that's reporting facts.
Here on Bloomberg, you never know what you're going to hear, and sometimes you hear it for the first time.
Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. And always on Bloomberg 1130. Context changes everything.
Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg Radio and soon to be on TV. You can find us on YouTube now as well. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. We'll meet you in the studio. Kaylee's on the way in next. This is Bloomberg.
Live from the financial capital of the world, broadcasting across the globe, this is WBBR New York, Bloomberg 1130. From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The meeting is underway. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. As President Biden meets today with Benjamin Netanyahu about Israel's war against Hamas and civilian casualties in Gaza. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Kaylee, we knew this would not be an easy call.
No, especially given the language we have already heard from President Biden in the aftermath of the death of 7 humanitarian aid workers working on behalf of World Central Kitchen earlier this week. World Central Kitchen, of course, founded by Jose Andres, the famous chef that is well known here in Washington and well known to President Biden himself.
Yep, that's right. This is going to be interesting to see how long the call lasts and how quickly we might get a readout from the White House on this. This is obviously not a public meeting and one that they're going to want to disseminate very carefully. We'll talk about that with our colleague Ian Marlowe, Bloomberg senior reporter covering diplomacy, just the perfect voice for this today with another important meeting going on. Janet Yellen just touched down in China.
Yeah, she'll be there for several days. She's going to be focusing obviously on economic issues, specifically the question around China's industrial overcapacity. Right. So we'll be looking to see what kind of headlines we may get out from the Treasury Secretary's second visit to China in just the last 9 months. We certainly have a lot to cover this hour. But of course, as always, here on Bloomberg TV and radio, we check first with Charlie Pellet, who's got a look at the markets in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kaylee. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, all advancing right now ahead of the jobs report tomorrow morning. Right now, the S&P 500 index up 39. That is a gain of about 0.8%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 172, up 0.4%. NASDAQ, the composite index, up 178, up 1.1%, while the NASDAQ 100 index also up by about 1.1%. The 10-year yield, 4.34%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.69%. Gold now lower by $12 the ounce to $22.87, a drop now of 0.5%. A retreat today for crude, down 0.4%, 85.12 a barrel on crude, and Bitcoin up 3.2%, Bitcoin 67,826. Google parent Alphabet has been talking to its advisors about the possibility of making an offer for HubSpot, an online marketing software company valued at about $34 billion. This according to Reuters, citing people familiar with the matter. HubSpot shares, they're up now by 7.9%. Google shares, Alphabet down by 0.5%. Again, recapping, stocks are higher. S&P right now up 39, up by about 0.7%. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. And once again, here they are, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Limes.
All right, Charlie Pellet with his eyes on the markets. Thank you so much. Meantime, Joe and I wishing we could have an ear to the door in the White House right now as President Biden speaks by phone with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. As you mentioned, Joe, it may be some time before we actually get a readout, or at least lines from the White House on what exactly it is Biden and Netanyahu discussed today. But we know probably the general gist of what the messaging from the U.S. president to the prime minister will be.
That's for sure. You made a great point following what happened on Monday. The story just changed. The op-ed from Jose Andres, the outcry that we've heard, the outrage that we've heard from progressive Democrats. This was not supposed to be an easy call, and I suspect that it is not. As we recall, and I mentioned this earlier today, that line from Joe Biden that when you're having trouble with Benjamin Netanyahu, you hug him closer. And I wonder how much hugging is going on right now for two men who have been largely estranged for the past couple of months. That's why we bring in Ian Marlowe for his take on this, Bloomberg senior reporter covering diplomacy. Ian is waiting, just like we are, for a readout on this meeting. I wonder, Ian, your thoughts on what might happen next and whether it leads to a change in policy.
That's the big question everyone is asking right now. There's no question that what happened with the World Central Kitchen, that aid workers, the 7 of them who were killed in that awful strike earlier this week, has changed the sort of tone and dynamic. And I think you've seen that from the Israeli side, apologies from the very highest levels of the Israeli government and the Israeli military apparatus. Biden coming out saying is outraged, Secretary of Defense Austin saying much the same. The question, though, is does this move the needle really when it comes to conditioning U.S. military support to Israel? And at the moment, everything that we see and hear from the administration seems to be that they're sort of continuing the line here. They've called for a swift and transparent investigation. In the past, in the last few months, when we've seen incidents where the U.S. has expressed concern or, even something getting close to condemnation of strikes that have killed too many civilians or aid not getting in, we've generally heard, we're concerned, we trust the Israelis to investigate, and we're sort of staying the course. What we saw the other week with the U.S. Not using their veto at the UN to knock down a United Nations resolution at the Security Council calling for an immediate ceasefire, that was sort of a sign of how strained things have gotten between the U.S. and Israel. But doing something at the UN, which the U.S. immediately came out and said was non-binding and stressed that it didn't really change much, and actually changing, the hard, impact of military support, which has, been going on for decades, that is the cornerstone of the relationship. That's a very big and different change that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, Ian, we had a similar conversation yesterday on this program with Jonathan Panikoff of the Atlantic Council. And what he told us was essentially the only leverage the U.S. has over Israel is really big ticket items. It's intelligence sharing. It's F-15s. It's major bombs. That is what foundationally this relationship has historically been built on. And if you were to start conditioning that kind of supply, that would fundamentally change the nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Is the fact of the matter here that there's just not really any low-hanging fruit for the U.S. to be using to influence the actions of Israel at this point?
Yeah, I think, and Panikoff has made the point that you can't go from 0 to 25 here. With this kind of military aid stuff, it goes straight 0 to 60. Do you know what I mean? There's not many things left that the U.S. can tinker with. I think U.S. officials, believe that they have conditioned and influenced Israel over the course of the conflict. They point to things like humanitarian aid getting through in the first place, which was never really a priority for Israel in the early days of the war. I was actually on Secretary Blinken's trip to Israel, where they engaged in something like 9 hours of negotiations that went until the middle of the night. Trying to get the Israelis to let in or agree to let in humanitarian aid in like the early weeks of the war. So, the U.S. does believe that they have had some influence over Israel since the beginning. But if you're a critic of the administration, if you're a critic of Israel, if you're one of the protesters outside, some of the embassies or, down in front of the State Department or the White House, looking at what's happened since the war began, it's kind of cold comfort. I mean, the U.S. says that there's They've helped with humanitarian aid, but then you see that there's a looming sort of man-made famine, as the UN says. There's now more than 30,000 civilians killed, according to the officials in the Hamas-run Gaza Strip. And it just kind of looks still that things have gotten worse. And so a lot of people think conditioning military aid is the only thing left, but it does really seem to be a little bit too far for this administration. And they have argued, privately and publicly, that would send a message to Hamas that the U.S. is really sort of on the brink of abandoning Israel entirely, because the without U.S. military support, Israel is going to be, Iron Dome missiles to munitions they're using in Gaza. A lot of that stuff would start to fall off and suffer sort of, in the near term. And then there's the longer term threats, from Hezbollah, right, in Lebanon, and the other Iranian proxies around the region. So there's a lot to think about there.
Absolutely. Ian Marlowe, Bloomberg senior reporter covering diplomacy and national security. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us. He, of course, has been following this story so closely, including, as he mentioned, traveling with the Secretary of State Antony Blinken to the region. And it's worth noting, Joe, that it's not just the Middle East where Secretary Blinken has been going or could very well go again in the future. He is expected to make his own trip to China a few weeks from now, after Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen.
I think Ian was with him on the last one, as a matter of fact. And this is, fascinating. Janet Yellen touching down there this morning. Are we getting into this sort of good cop, bad cop mode with Yellen and Blinken, and then, in every quarterly call maybe with Joe Biden? I'm kind of trying to understand the roles that everyone in this administration are playing.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I would certainly expect that Janet Yellen, in her position as the Secretary of the Treasury and also as a former Federal Reserve Chair, will be far more focused on economic issues than maybe some of the geopolitical issues around Taiwan or something else that the Secretary of State would probably bring. But this is part of just a rotation of cabinet secretaries talking about all of their different issues that pertain to their departments as they make these visits to China. And on that note, we want to speak with someone who knows China incredibly well. Gary Locke is joining us now. He's former U.S. ambassador to China, also former U.S. Secretary of Commerce. Mr. Locke, thank you so much for being with us. This is, as we've mentioned, Secretary Yellen's second trip in 9 months. What tangible could come out of this second visit? How much tangible ever comes out of things like this?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you, Joe and Kaylee. And let me just say that this trip by Secretary Yellen is very important in continuing the progress and the momentum of talks between President Biden and President Xi many, many months ago. We're seeing a thaw in the relationship, and it's critical because we have issues of great contention between the United States and China, but also issues and opportunities of great cooperation, whether it's working against North Korea to stop them from developing a nuclear weapon, to finding a cure for cancer, or trying to address climate change. There are so many areas in which the world is expecting partnership and leadership from both the United States and China. But at the same time, we have some very difficult, very hot issues, economic issues, geopolitical issues between the United States and China. So the more dialogue there is between the top leaders, top officials of both countries, the greater the progress will be in these areas.
Ambassador, we heard from Secretary Yellen on her stopover, her layover in Alaska on the way to China, speaking specifically to our economic relationship, which has been evolving. Listen to what she said, and we'll have you respond. Here she is.
We've agreed that it's important to both of us that we don't want to decouple our economies. We want to continue, and we think we both benefit from trade and investment, but that it needs to be in a level playing field.
If that was hard to hear, Ambassador, she's talking about not decoupling, as we've heard before, but that it needs to be on a level playing field. And we're hearing that this administration is carving out space to protect additional new industries, like we've seen with high-tech chips, for instance. And I wonder to what extent you see that, in fact, leading to a decoupling.
Well, there will be some natural decoupling with countries all around the world and involving many different sectors, because as the pandemic demonstrated, no country wants to be overly reliant on supplies, whether it's consumer goods, manufactured goods, or medical supplies from another country. because if there's another pandemic or even a natural disaster, a huge earthquake or political upheaval in another country, we don't want, for instance, companies in America suddenly cut off from so much of what they receive from China, which is why you're seeing a lot of companies, multinational companies, U.S. companies, foreign companies, diversifying their supply chain so that they're not so reliant on China. So much of what American consumers use every day and purchase every day in their daily lives comes from China, whether it's microwaves, whether it's the tools that they use, clothes and shoes, barbecue sets, you name it. Much of that comes from China. So that creates jobs for the Chinese people. At the same time, China depends very much on American-made goods, including our farm goods, our agricultural goods. China is America's largest agricultural export destination outside of Canada or outside of North America. And so our farmers depend on selling their soybeans and their wheat and their apples and their cherries to China, along with Boeing. Boeing's number one, most of Boeing airplanes are sold to carriers around the world, including China. So our economies are intertwined, and which is why Secretary Yellen is saying we don't want a complete decoupling, but companies, whether Chinese companies or American companies, are beginning to diversify their supply chain to include other parts of the world.
Well, as we talk about the supply that comes from China, Ambassador, one of the things we know that the Treasury Secretary is going to be talking about specifically is industrial overcapacity and the way that that can be manipulated in terms of supply and demand to affect pricing or access to certain things that China is producing. When she goes and airs those concerns, how likely is it that China is going to receive those and say, okay, yes, you're right, we will be changing our behavior on that front? Isn't it to China's advantage to continue that kind of overcapacity in production?
Well, China is trying to jumpstart their economy coming out of the pandemic by offering subsidies and government incentives for industrial output. Certainly, they are leading the world in terms of the manufacturing of electric automobiles and the battery technology that goes with electric automobiles and buses, and also in the solar area. But if they do so by stimulating or having too much capacity, dumping their products into the world, flooding the world with their products and driving prices down, that's going to actually destabilize the economies and sectors in many other countries, including here in the United States, with some of the infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Act incentives to bring manufacturing back to America, especially in the solar, clean energy area. That will disrupt and undercut many of the efforts that America and other countries have embarked upon, which will lead to perhaps retaliatory measures against Chinese companies for dumping, unfair subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, that will upset the world trade relationship and even cause problems for China itself. So I think the message from Secretary Yellen is, yes, you want to be the world's leading supplier of electric automobiles and battery technology and solar equipment, but you have to do it on a level playing field. And I think that's the key message there. Otherwise, there will be repercussions, not just by the United States, but by other countries around the world. And that can also, in the long term, hurt China.
Spending time here on Bloomberg TV and radio with Gary Locke, the former U.S. ambassador to China. We want to let our audience know that we've just received word from the White House that President Biden's meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu has come to a close. Ambassador, I know it's not what you're here to talk about today, but in our last moment, and I don't want to set you up to cut you off here, but what does China think about America's involvement in the Middle East?
Well, China is watching very carefully to see how the United States responds, along with how the United States responds to Russia's invasion and military action in the Ukraine, and what the West does. Does the West really back up its allies? Will it live up to its word of guarantee? Because otherwise, there are many countries in the South Pacific, in the Pacific region, where the United States has pledged protection and defense And
Beijing is watching. Ambassador, thank you. I wish we had more time with you. Come back and talk to us again. Gary Locke, of course, as well, the former governor of Washington, former U.S. Secretary of Commerce. I'm Joe Matthew with Kaylee Lyons in Washington. This is Bloomberg. Make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. You know the drill. Go to Apple, Spotify, wherever you do that stuff, and subscribe. Find us live on YouTube right now and listen anytime at Bloomberg.com.
Tomorrow, we zero in on March jobs.
Headline unemployment rate of 3.9%.
The fully employed America.
Will the numbers affect how the Fed views the labor market?
What's the why for 200,000 per month?
Continued resilience in the job market.
The March jobs report on Bloomberg Surveillance.
Job growth blew past expectations.
Markets on the move here.
Tomorrow morning at 8:30. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. And always on Bloomberg 1130. Context changes everything.
Sorry, but we actually have a wait list for our Monstera.
Shaw's greenhouse is really bringing in the green.
We can't keep snake plants in stock.
She needs a construction manager to build on her roots and grow.
We could add a whole section for ferns, and here we'd have dahlias, dahlias, and more dahlias.
Indeed can help her hire great people fast.
I need Indeed.
Indeed you do. You can schedule and conduct virtual interviews all from your employer dashboard. Visit Indeed.com/credit and get $75 towards your first sponsored job. Terms and conditions apply.
eBay Motors is here for the ride. Go ahead, feel your engine. Admire that perfectly installed exhaust. Your vehicle's moving along this freeway like it was made from fresh installs and a whole lot of love. With eBay Motors, you get over 122 million parts to keep it running. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, they'll be the perfect fit every time. Plus, at these prices, well, we're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
Business stories aren't just about business. They're also about policy, politics, finance, and more. With Bloomberg, you stay informed on global coverage that connects the dots. The Bloomberg mobile app now features Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, so you can get the latest live radio, podcasts, and audio articles in the car. You'll have the context that changes how you see things and change things. Download the Bloomberg mobile app now to get started. Find it in the Apple App Store or on Google Play.
Artificial intelligence has propelled innovation for companies and bad actors alike. To keep your business safe from cyber mayhem, you need to harness AI that can stay one step ahead of cyber criminals. Adopting proactive security, powered by the best of AI, can keep your business going. That's security in action. To learn more, visit checkpoint.com/action.
Now your 3-day weather forecast on Bloomberg 1130.
Clouds may break up a little bit during this afternoon, revealing some sun. Otherwise, it is cloudy with a few scattered showers. Temperatures upper 40s, low 50s. Tonight, evening showers, 35 to 40. Maybe an afternoon shower Friday, partly sunny, breezy, and 50. In the 50s here for Saturday, partly sunny, and mostly sunny on Sunday with highs back up to near 60. This is Gary Best with your weekend weather forecast on Bloomberg 1130.
Coming up on Balance of Power, Biden's call with Netanyahu has wrapped up, according to a source familiar at the White House. We'll talk about the political ramifications for the president next with our political panel. This is Bloomberg.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street from Bloomberg World Headquarters. I'm Charlie Pellet. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, and yes, the Russell 2000 all advancing. Broad-based rally today ahead of the jobs report tomorrow morning. Here's where we stand. S&P right now up by 0.7%, higher by 39 points. The S&P at 5250. Dow Industrials right now up 178 points, up by about 0.5%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index is advancing now by 172 points for NASDAQ. That is a gain now of 1.1%. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.35% with a 2-year 4.68%. Spot gold is trading lower by $9 the ounce to $22.90, down by about 0.4%. Crude oil lower by 0.4% as well. WTI 85.13. Bitcoin up 3.2%, 67,862 on Bitcoin. Paramount Global shares are lower today as investors digest reports that the media company is getting closer to a deal to merge with Skydance Media. Analysts expressed some questions over a potential deal. Yesterday, you recall, the stock spiked about 15%. Today, Paramount Global down by 8.2%. Again, recapping, stocks higher. S&P right now up 39, up by about 0.8%. Balance of power continues. Back we go to Washington, and once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet with a look at the Thursday trade. Thank you so much. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. And Joe, the fact that it is Thursday puts us now 3 days out since the death of 7